Hi everyone, I'm Caitlin Roper from Collective Shout, and I'm happy to be here via video, although I wish I could be there with you in person. Over the last few years, some of you might have noticed there's been a clear trend with mainstream news media outlets publishing pro-sex industry content that isn't really news. Articles about women getting rich and empowered by doing porn, leaving their jobs to create pornographic content on OnlyFans, or making lots of money as sugar babies. And these kind of articles are regularly being published by major news outlets. Having noticed the sex industry receiving a lot of free and mostly uncritical attention in the media, Collective Shout and CATWA, the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women Australia, thought the promotion and normalisation of the sex industry in mainstream media warranted closer investigation. Our researchers resulted in the report Side Hustles and Sexual Exploitation, Australian News Media Reporting and Commentary on the Sex Industry During the COVID-19 Pandemic, to be released on International Women's Day. Today I'll just be giving a bit of an overview of the report and summarising some of our key findings. So I'll start with just a little bit of background on COVID and women in particular. So the COVID-19 pandemic has had a catastrophic impact on women and girls in Australia and globally. Rates of male violence against women have skyrocketed, with the United Nations naming this as a shadow pandemic. Lockdowns have exacerbated the problem, with many women reporting experiencing violence for the first time, and those with prior histories saying that it had intensified. The pandemic also significantly impacted on women's ability to support themselves and their families. During extended COVID lockdowns, women experienced a triple whammy. They were more likely to lose their jobs, more likely to do a lot more unpaid work, and less likely to get government support. Women with young children were particularly affected, having to scale back employment to take on childcare responsibilities and to oversee remote learning. But fathers' time in paid employment remained relatively unaffected. Women who were already financially struggling were most impacted by the pandemic. One report showed 8 out of 10 women who lost work were single mothers. Because women are more likely to be employed in casual positions, they were often ineligible for JobKeeper payments when they lost their jobs. The sex industry has traditionally been fueled by male violence and female poverty, both exacerbated by the pandemic. Women in the sex trade are at particular risk of contracting COVID, and male buyers have taken advantage of women's increased vulnerability by demanding cheaper prices and being more aggressive. The media has been a significant promoter of the sex industry. Media narratives can influence our behaviour and our beliefs, and what the media says about the sex industry is vital to how we come to understand it and the messages we repeat about it in the world. So we asked ourselves, what stories about the sex industry are the Australian news media telling us? More specifically, we wanted to know, how did the Australian media cover the sex industry during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic? So our process, we examined articles and editorial or opinion pieces from 11 online Australian news sources: The Age, Herald Sun, Daily Telegraph, The Australian, ABC, SBS, news.com.au, Junkie, Mamamia, New Matilda, and Guardian Australia. And we did this from March 2020, the start of the pandemic, to March 2021. We used broad key search terms, excluding articles that weren't primarily about the sex industry, and we were left with 422 articles for analysis. We looked for value judgments about the sex industry. We wanted to see whether articles represented the industry in a positive, a neutral, or negative way. We also looked for location, the sex or gender of the prostituted person and of the sex buyer, and the race or ethnicity of the prostituted person. Of 422 articles analysed, over 40% were classified as neutral, where events were described rather than presenting a stance on the sex industry. But where there was a clear stance, articles mainly depicted the sex industry in a positive light. We found that 42% of articles portrayed the sex industry positively, and only 18% of articles painted the industry in a generally negative light. Research suggests that most prostituted and trafficked people are women and girls, and that most sex buyers are men. Despite this, our findings showed that only 64% of news articles clearly identified women as those selling sex, and only 36% of articles explicitly identified sex buyers as male. So going now to some of the key themes. I'll start with portrayals of prostituted women. Prostitution was frequently portrayed as not just a job, but an expression of female sexuality and the means to autonomy and empowerment. Selling sex, mainly in the form of creating pornographic content on OnlyFans, was promoted as a confidence-building endeavor for women. Prostitution was also framed as a way for women to achieve personal fulfillment and to be their true self. For example, women were reported as crediting platforms like OnlyFans with making them so much happier by allowing them to unashamedly be the true sexual being I've always been and to feel more comfortably in my own self. A number of articles emphasized women's independence and credited platforms like OnlyFans with giving women more control. These reports were in stark contrast to the reality of the sex trade. Women in the sex industry are among some of the most marginalized and economically disadvantaged, with Indigenous women, migrant women, and women of color overrepresented in it. Despite this, news media outlets overwhelmingly told the stories of the outliers, positive reports from the small minority of women who reportedly experienced prostitution as affirming and profitable. Voices of women who were exploited and harmed, or who made very little money, were rarely included. Narratives of women's choice and empowerment were presented with almost no consideration of the circumstances under which women entered the sex trade, like their financial desperation, which was glossed over. Selling sex was also presented to single mothers as a way to rebuild their lives post-separation, to provide for their children and run their own show. One piece on news.com.au told the story of a mother of 4 who became a Playboy model to regain confidence after getting divorced. This was a good thing, according to the news article, quote, showing other mums that it is never too late to fulfill your modeling dreams. Portrayals of sex buyers. As we know, buyers are overwhelmingly men who mostly buy women and children. But the sex of sex industry customers was rarely mentioned, except where the article was about violence they had perpetrated. The sex of the buyer was clearly specified, though, when the buyer was a woman. Despite the reality of men as the primary sex buyers, female sex buyers were the subject of multiple stories on Mamma Mia. Women's participation in the sex industry as buyers was often positioned as a form of sexual education or the means to developing their sexual identity. One article published by Mamma Mia recounted the experience of an enthusiastic female sex buyer who had to convince her reluctant male partner to participate in her purchase of online sexual services while stuck at home during lockdown. The sex industry was positioned as a way for women buyers to get to know their own body or even their own mind, with pornography identified as a route of exploration and revelation and a path to oneself. Portrayals of sex industry critics. Critics of the sex industry were generally presented in a negative light. Critics of the industry, or more specifically, critics of men's violence, exploitation, and abuse of women and children within it, were frequently portrayed as being religiously motivated, as making unsubstantiated claims of harm, and cast as aggressors in a moralistic holy war against the sex industry. Despite having been exposed for hosting child rape videos, sex trafficking, and non-consensually shared content, Pornhub was painted as progressive, quote, sex worker positive, supportive of LGBTIQ+, and racial justice issues, end quote, while those who objected to the platform's hosting of illegal and abusive content were framed as regressive and anti-sex. Some articles question the motives of individuals who objected to Pornhub, describing objections as, quote, a conservative attack cloaked as concern, and a war on sex work. We found contradictory messages about the online sex industry. On the one hand, the online space was portrayed as booming and lucrative, and on the other, a site of violence, exploitation, and criminal behaviour, with revenge porn posed as a serious threat to women's safety. We found that illegal or violent conduct related to the sex industry was often framed in salacious ways. One example was in a Daily Telegraph article reporting on the inquest into the death of a woman in the sex trade, which described a key suspect as the last person to see her alive when he hired her for a sexual escapade. Women's experiences in the sex industry were individualized. While women's financial hardship as the result of COVID-19 was widely reported, it was not addressed as a structural problem requiring structural solutions, like increased welfare provisions or government assistance. Instead, structural issues made worse by the pandemic were framed as the problem of individuals, which could be solved through individual women entering the sex industry. Men's violence against women in the sex trade was also framed as something done by individual men, as exceptional or a one-off incident. There was little analysis of the conditions fostering their violence, and those men perpetrating violence were framed as one bad apple, or monsters, who didn't represent the majority of sex buyers or brothel owners. By presenting violent sex buyers as troubled individuals, rather than identifying prostitution as a system of male violence against women and girls, media rendered invisible the role of male demand in driving the sex trade. Instances of violence and abuse were portrayed as outside the inherent functioning of the industry and disconnected from its commodification of women. We also found conflicting messages about the financial realities of the sex trade. In many articles, women were positioned as bound to the sex industry for income out of necessity and financially devastated by the closure of face-to-face work. But then at the same time, the sex industry was presented as the means for women to achieve financial security. Overall, the Australian media presented an overwhelmingly positive narrative about the sex trade during the COVID-19 pandemic. From the report, we found there is now a dominant narrative of the sex industry as a viable, even desirable career choice or aspirational lifestyle for women. In selling the sex industry to women in this way, we found the media was not only reporting about the sex industry, but actively promoting it. In an industry based on the sexual objectification of women's bodies and various forms of male violence and exploitation of women and children, the Australian media's endorsement of a reduction in regulation should be of significant concern to anyone who seeks to uphold the human rights of women and girls. End quote. News media repeatedly advocated for full decriminalisation of the sex industry, which decriminalises sex buying, pimping, and brothel keeping. No consideration was given to feminist solutions that have been implemented around the world, like the Nordic equality model, which targets male demand for purchasing the bodies of women and girls. In presenting full decriminalisation as desirable, news media presented the sex industry as a legitimate form of employment. Our report reveals a dangerous blind spot in Australian media reporting of the sex industry. We call on the Australian media to recognise the links between women's experiences of financial insecurity, male violence against women, and exploitation in the sex industry. This involves engaging with survivors of the sex trade who have exited and are critical of it. So what can you do? You can share this report, share it with your networks, on social media, or with your local MP. You can like and follow our organisations on social media to stay up to date on this issue and what we're doing in this space. You can oppose moves to decriminalise the sex trade in your state or other states in Australia. Write to your state MP and ask them to explore the Nordic model. You can even organise a face-to-face meetup with them. Thanks for watching, and I hope that our report can be a useful tool in advocacy against the commercial sexual exploitation of women.